Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Stacy, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. I'm so glad we are pretty much like 2/3 the way. Hopefully we can get to $30,000, our goal before the year ends. But as Stacy said, I want to kind of start off by telling you where two of the most courageous attorneys in the world right now are. And they're not here, as Stacy mentioned. This was supposed to be their moment, their chance to celebrate work that changed the course of history. But look at that picture. This is Giselle Helico. And the two men standing behind her, and you'll get a better shot soon. Those are our two leadership awardees, Stéphane Babineau and Antoine Camus. And as Stacy mentioned, they are exactly where they need to be. They were so excited, they really wanted to come here, as Stacy mentioned, but then last week really changed everything. One man, just one of the 51 men who were convicted of raping Ms. Pellicoat, filed an appeal. And that trial began on Monday. And without hesitation, Stéphane and Antoine had made their decision. Their client needed them. So instead of standing here, they have been standing beside her in a courtroom in France. Why? Well, that's because that is exactly what real leadership looks like. It's showing up when your client needs you the most, even when it means sacrificing everything else. And that choice to put the client first is why we are honoring them tonight. Now, let me tell you why their work represents a turning point in history. You see, for nearly a decade, Ms. Pellicoat's husband drugged her unconscious and invited strangers from the internet into their home to repeatedly rape her. 72 different men, 92 documented rapes, 20,000 images and videos cataloged like trophies. Unconscious, she had no idea. And imagine that. She thought she was losing her mind. Her hair fell out. She lost weight. She thought she had Alzheimer's. And her husband stood beside her in those doctor's visits, lying, while continuing to orchestrate the abuse. Nearly a decade of horror. But if we go to the next slide, look at this image. Ms. Pellicoat, flanked by her attorneys, facing men who had violated her while she was unconscious, men who claimed that they didn't know that it was rape. I thought she was pretending to be asleep. That was their defense, despite video evidence. And this is where Stéphane and Antoine stepped into history, because they didn't just see a criminal case. They saw a chance to dismantle rape culture, one courtroom at a time. So when the judge in the French legal system offered Ms. Pellicoat privacy, she said two words that would echo worldwide: absolutely not. And her attorneys made that possible by returning what had been stolen from her: her autonomy, her voice. For 9 years, every choice had been taken from her. Instead of deciding for her own good, they asked, "What do you want?" And when she said she wanted the world to see, they said, "This is your story. This is your choice. We'll fight to make sure that that happens." They understood that this wasn't just about one woman's case. It was about rewriting how justice treats survivors. They built their strategy around her autonomy. They didn't sanitize it, they didn't summarize it, but instead they showed France what it would look like when rape was actually confronted. 51 men, a firefighter who was actually wearing his uniform at the moments that he was raping this woman, a nurse, a journalist, husbands, fathers, they all walked into her bedroom, saw her limp, seeing her husband having to hold up her head, and they raped her anyway. And then, at the initial trial, they claimed they didn't know that it was rape. These men weren't just lawyering. They were restoring her power. And that's transformational leadership. As Stacey mentioned, Ms. Pellico had said the shame isn't ours to feel, it's theirs. And that's really what Stefan and Antoine turned those words into a battle cry, a blueprint for dismantling rape culture. If you look at this image, defendants are actually hiding their faces, while Giselle Pellico, she held her head high. And this is the reversal we've been fighting for. For generations, rape culture has operated on one rule, and that is that survivors are to carry the shame. Society still asks survivors, what were you wearing? Why didn't you fight? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you report it sooner? Society still puts survivors on trial while rapists walk free. It tells them, protect their families, protect their abusers, their reputations. Society tells survivors to stay silent because their truth makes the world uncomfortable. And Stefan and Antoine looked at that system and said, not this time, not this client. They flipped the script, forcing the shame back onto those perpetrators. They gave Ms. Pellico the tools to decide that she would not be the one who hid. She was not going to be the one that had to whisper. She wasn't going to be the one that had to disappear. Because that is how you dismantle rape culture. Not in theory, but in practice. And I've stood in those courtrooms, and it takes leaders who see their clients not as broken, but as powerful. As we saw from you today, Kyle. Not as victims to be managed, but as survivors to be restored, or as Kyla most beautifully and eloquently put it, as thrivers. And that's what they did. They didn't just represent Ms. Pellico. They stood beside her as she confronted the culture that had enabled her abuse. And listen to what she said. She said, I wanted all of society to be a witness to the debates that took place here. This wasn't revenge, it was a revolution. Because rape culture depends on society's silence. It thrives when we call sexual violence a private matter. It survives when courts pretend husbands, fathers, firefighters, or certain people don't rape. Ms. Pellico knew that her case could shatter those lies. If society saw 51 ordinary men, firefighters, journalists, people, insisting that they didn't know that an unconscious woman couldn't consent, then perhaps those myths would collapse. And Stefan and Antoine made sure that the world would see that. They didn't tell her to be quiet. They said, we believe you, and we're gonna fight for your vision. And that's the kind of leadership that VRLC really recognizes. We saw that with Tony, right? Our Shining Star recipient. VRLC recognizes this, and they live that every day because VRLC recognizes and understands that rape culture is dismantled. One survivor, one case, one attorney at a time. Survivors don't need to be saved. They need to be believed. They need to be supported. They need to be empowered. And that's how you end rape culture. The survivor's voice matters more than anyone else's comfort. And Giselle Pellico said, I want them to say that if Madame Pellico did it, I can too. And think about that. Rape culture tells survivors, hide, stay quiet, protect the perpetrator. And a 72-year-old woman who discovered 10 years ago that she was being drugged and raped by her husband said, no, I will be loud, I will be seen, and I will be the proof that speaking out changes everything. And that's the power of visibility. That's what VRLC fights for every single day. Because right now, somewhere in this state, a survivor is being told to stay quiet. And they need an attorney who is going to say that your voice matters, that your choice matters, that your truth matters, that your dignity, being able to protect their medical and psychiatric records from a criminal defendant, that matters. And that's what VRLC provides for free. They train attorneys to challenge rape culture, not to reinforce it. They teach them how to center survivor autonomy, to make law a tool of healing, not harm. Antoine Camus said, she will be there to explain that a rape is a rape and that there is no such thing as a small rape. Because after the December convictions that Miss Pellico had to actually testify, after those convictions, 17 men appealed. 16 of those 17 men withdrew their appeals. One didn't. Hussein Zouam. And in court this week, they played those videos again. What videos? Miss Pellico, sedated, unmoving, unconscious, laying in the fetal position, unable to control her head movement. And Juan still claimed that he thought when he raped her that it was consensual. And that's because that's what rape culture does. It lets a man watch himself raping an unconscious woman and still insist he didn't know she was not consenting. When are you going to recognize that you raped me? Miss Pellico asked him. When did I ever give you consent? Never, is what she said to him. And that's why she keeps showing up. Because as long as even one person refuses to call that rape, the work is not done. And her attorneys were right beside her. They canceled their flights to Boston. They gave up this wonderful night, and they walked back in that courtroom right beside her. Because leadership isn't convenient. Leadership is choosing your values every single time. And that's what VRLC teaches. And that's what we're celebrating tonight. These men are not just activists. They are world-class attorneys who chose to undo the thesis of accidental rape. They fought not just for one woman, but for every survivor told that it wasn't really rape. They established a principle that should never have been in question. That if someone is unconscious, if someone is intoxicated, if someone cannot consent, ignorance is not a defense. A husband or spouse or partner's permission to rape their partner or spouse is worthless. Rape is rape. That's moral leadership, and it's exactly what VRLC models every single day in courtrooms across Massachusetts. And look what happened. France erupted. Graffiti appeared. Injustice patriarchal. Thousands marched in 30 cities. And France acted. 3 months after the original trial, the government approved a sex education curriculum for schools. Lawmakers introduced legislation to add consent into France's legal definition of rape for the first time. And that was one case, one survivor, 2 attorneys, and the world shifted. That's what happens when attorneys use law as a tool for transformation. And VRLC understands that power. VRLC wields that power. Every time you train an attorney, you're changing culture. And for the firm, McDermott, Will, and Schultz, you're changing the law. You're building a world where survivors don't carry shame and where rapists can't hide behind excuses. Merci, Giselle. Thank you, Giselle. Look at those signs. People lined the streets. They sang to her. They applauded. They brought her flowers. But they weren't just thanking her for surviving. They were thanking her for refusing to do what rape culture demanded of her, which was to disappear and to be silent or to carry the shame that wasn't hers. Giselle gave millions of survivors something precious. Proof that speaking out, that standing out changes everything. That survivors don't have to hide. And the impact rippled outward in ways that will echo for generations. And survivors across France, across the world, have new hope. And that's what one case can do. That's what happens when attorneys trust their client's vision and fight to honor her choices. And that's what VRLC does every single day. VRLC trains attorneys to see what Stefan and Antoine saw, that survivors don't need to be protected into silence. They need to be supported into power. VRLC fights for the systematic changes that make cases like Ms. Pellicote's the catalyst for cultural transformation. That's the legacy that we're building together. That's why tonight matters. That's why your support can change everything. Ms. Pellicote said, I couldn't have done anything without them. I know, Tony, your clients say that. And every volunteer in here, your clients have said that. But with regard to Ms. Pellicote and all of your clients, just let that sink in. For Ms. Pellicote, her extraordinary courage changed history. She became a global icon. And yet it's her that says she couldn't have done it without her attorneys. Because leadership isn't solitary. Courage needs support. Vision needs strategy. Survivors need attorneys who believe in them, absolutely. But if we divert our attention back to the image, you see three people walking together. Not just one person in the front. Not attorneys leading their clients, but partners, a team, moving forward together. That's the model. That's what VRLC teaches every attorney they train. That's what makes this work sacred. Stéphane and Antoine spent 4 days in a French courtroom standing beside Giselle Pellicot. They showed up. And this afternoon, our time, just hours ago, the verdict did come down. That man was guilty all over again. The French system is a little different from ours. Basically, it's a second trial where she'd have to testify again. But here's the powerful part. The conviction wasn't just upheld. They increased his sentence because on the first conviction, he got 9 years. On this one, he got 10. The man who claimed he was the victim, he was the one who said what he did was just a sexual act. He was the one who refused to call it rape after watching the video evidence. And the system said, you are wrong. What you did was rape. And your refusal to take responsibility makes it worse, not better. And so justice prevailed. And that's what happens when you show up for your clients. And we are here today, tonight, because we have to show up too. You heard the goal, $30,000. Please keep in mind, VRLC provides free legal representation to survivors across Massachusetts. Think about that. Free. Because survivors should not have to choose between justice and paying rent, between speaking out and feeding their children. VRLC trains attorneys, teaching them not just legal strategy, but how to honor survivors' voices, how to center their dignity, how to fight for transformation. VRLC advocates for policy changes, working to build a system where survivors don't have to be as extraordinarily brave as Kyla or Miss Pellicot just to be delivered. This is the work. This is the leadership. And this is what your support makes possible. So I'm asking you, in the steps of Judy, I'm challenging you to match the leadership that we're celebrating tonight. If Miss Pellicot can walk back into that courtroom at 72 years old, we can donate generously tonight. And that's because somewhere tonight, there is a young lawyer who needs the training VRLC provides to become the kind of attorney that changes history. Somewhere, there's a system that needs to be challenged, a law that needs to be challenged, a culture that needs to be transformed. And VRLC is doing the work every single day with excellence, as we saw, with compassion, as we saw, and with unwavering commitment. We together can fund VRLC's work so more survivors get the representation that they deserve. And as Ms. Pellicot said, the shame isn't ours to feel, it's theirs. So together, let's make sure every survivor knows that truth. Let's make sure that every perpetrator faces accountability. And let's make sure that every attorney has the tools and training to fight for transformation. Stéphane Babineau and Antoine Camus couldn't be here, obviously, to accept this award. But they're accepting it right now in that courtroom in France by doing exactly what the award recognizes, showing up for their client with unwavering dedication. So let's honor them as well by showing up too, for VRLC, for survivors, for justice. Because as Giselle said, I want them to say, if Madame Palicot did it, I can too. And if she can do it, we can too. Let's prove it tonight. $30,000 is the goal.